anytime a woman gives up money, wouldn't she like to know that her money's going to an institution that gives her fairness? Like universities are
Sure.
terribly unfair, right? Women are paying
Yes.
$70,000 a year, and the leadership at universities and deans and the higher paid professors are mostly men, 74%, according to this one study. So
Yeah.
to me, that's incredibly unfair to prepare these women for the world and not give them every sort of advantage of a totally fair environment. I would want my money. I would want some money back, actually, if
Yeah.
I were.
Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching and or listening to my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And it is a Facebook Live event. It's also recorded. It is on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, all the usual places. And then is a podcast that is in 4 or 5 places that podcasts can be listened to. So today I am with my guest, who is in Canada, as I understand it. Her name is Amy Cross. She is founder of Gender Fair, which is a gender equity group, a leader in the work toward pay equity and using power and capital to drive change. And we were introduced by a mutual friend, Jose Zylstra. I think that's how I met you, or was it when I was watching something with WBC, which is the women's business?
WBC. I think we were talking. Yeah, so that.
Okay, but you obviously you know Jose, and
Yeah.
okay. So how far back with Jose do you go? Just
A
have
sister,
interest.
a sister in the struggle. We met in like 2015, I think it was, at a
Okay,
book launch for Rebecca Traister, and we've been working together ever since. She is a great partner, and we are both like doggedly determined to speed up the geological time frame of gender equality.
I like the geological time frame. Isn't that crazy? I mean, yeah, tectonic plates. Another 10,000 years.
That's why I once had a tenant actually, and I said something was a long time. He says, "Well, I'm a geologist, so I think in geological time."
Yes.
If
Yeah, it
it's
hasn't been a long time yet. That's on a different scale. So now you're in Canada. Are you American or Canadian?
Yes, I'm American, but I've been living in Canada for 30 years,
Of
and
course, the Canadians don't like the word American because they're Americans too in the strict geographical sense, North Americans.
right,
But
when they say North Americans, but Americans hate that idea. I think when I wrote my first book, I used the phrase North American, and even though I got it, and Americans hated that. They don't like to read North
yeah,
American. It's a sure sign, but it's a kind of a kinder country, I must say.
yes. Yeah, I've spent some time in Canada. Back in another lifetime, I made feature films and I shot one in Toronto. I forget when, 1990, I think it was. And my wife Jeannie and I and the kids were up there for a couple of months and in winter. But I live in New England, so it was not too big of a shock. Let me roll way, way back with you. You mentioned some books, so you can take this in whatever order. Just tell me a little bit about your journey from, say, pick an age, 15 to today, in terms of what you do related
Oh,
to the fight
okay.
for women and equity. What's that path?
That
Just
that
talk to
path,
me a
that's an
little bit.
easy path. That's a story I know. I know that's a story starts in grade five, actually, fifth grade. I
And let
wrote
me
my
ask
first.
this, is some of this story in a book, or is this just you
No,
relating to?
no, no, no. I wrote when I was a writer. I wrote books about other things, not me.
Okay.
And
So tell the story. That would be
oh,
good.
yeah, the story is a great story. Well, I descend from suffragists. I descend from a long line of Southern feminists and suffragists who went to women's colleges since 1880. So that's in my background. But I grew up, in regular America. Anyway, so I did my first play when I was 10. It was called Men's Liberation. And this is around in the early 70s, and it was a utopia where actually it wasn't a utopia. Women were the oppressors and men were the oppressed. And so I inverted the gender roles that were common in popular culture. I had the women playing poker and ignoring their children and wives, and then the men had a revolution, and the wives said they would take them to Bahamas or something. That was the conclusion of the play. I produced it, I wrote it, I acted in it, I directed it, and it was in the cafeteria, my school cafeteria.
And where was that school, by the way?
Outside of Washington, D.C. in Alexandria, Virginia, a liberal brigadoon of modernist houses my father had designed in the 1960s.
And while speaking of your father,
Yeah.
how were your parents involved in that stage of your life, and who were they? Because if we're going back to 10, we want
Wow,
to know about your
this is
home.
like therapy. Cool. Well, I was very lucky. I had great parents. My father was a son of a preacher man, so he was very good, but he was a Unitarian, so he didn't like, he didn't like Christian religion.
And the preacher man was a Unitarian. That's how he grew
No, the
up.
preacher man was Episcopalian, so I come
Okay.
from a long line of preachers. So my father was very liberal, and they were great parents. They had 4 children. They gave us lots of love. My father he always told us he made a real sacrifice in his career because he was a very talented architect. He went to Harvard. He studied with Gropius. He was, had a great early life, but he decided he wanted to be home every night for 7 o'clock dinner.
Hmm.
And he didn't work late and he didn't go to parties, which of course, it's very beneficial in any business to go to parties, to meet people, meet clients, meet funders. And he didn't do that. He was home every night at 7 because he'd been a child of divorce and boarding school, and he wanted to have a stable life for his family. And so he regretted it sometimes, but we totally respect him because he was a very present father, and he read to us. He made us poached eggs, but there was still a lot of gender imbalance. But my mother was the major breadwinner sometimes, so it wasn't exactly the regular Beaver Cleaver vision of America.
Are your parents still living?
No.
Both gone?
Yes, both gone. That's
And your father, when he was coming home and making the poached eggs and reading to you, and your mom was involved, were you at home a lot with them, or were they busy people as well, even if your mom wasn't working or worked on and off, whatever? What was the life like on a daily basis that you remember, say, at that age when you're writing a play about reversal of gender roles?
Right. I mean, that could have just been from pop culture and the TV that we didn't have, but no, my dad, they would go to civic meetings sometimes, but also they weren't out, at cocktail parties very much. Like, they were very devoted to their families. They did civic and political work a little bit, but they were mainly home. They were home, and yeah.
Was his journey from the Episcopal background to the Unitarian Church sort of one of rebellion and walking away from one thing into another?
Absolutely. It's hard to be a preacher's son, as you know.
As I
It's
know,
very hard
yeah.
to be a preacher's son. It's just, you have to be really good. And he was incredibly handsome, my father. He was like, even in his 80s, women would talk about how handsome he was. So, like, I'm sure women would always be throwing themselves at him, but he was like a good man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How much of his own philosophical sort of change in thinking from Episcopalian to Unitarian during your childhood and then into your teen years, how much were you aware of the fact he had been on a kind of a journey?
It was very clear. My grandparents were both very old school conservative people who did take us to the Anglican Episcopalian Church. So we could see the difference, and they were very, socially conservative. Or not my grandfather; he was an Anglican priest. Yeah, so you could definitely see that there was a jump. It was not a smooth, would you say, evolution from his
Sure.
parents to him. He was clearly had rebelled. Just no, yeah. Rebelled.
And which context what context did he meet your mom in? Was it in the Anglican world, or was it in the
my mother's
Unitarian, or none of the above?
my mother's family, my mother's grandmother, my mother's mother lived as a housekeeper for my grandfather, the minister in his big rectory. She was a parishioner who had a fire in her house, and so he invited her to live in the house. And back to your notion about how important family is, a Swedish woman who, wasn't really a housekeeper. I mean, she went to go be the housekeeper for a while so she could live with her family. And she had 6 children, and my father loved being upstairs with the big, noisy Swedish family. Because, not noisy, they wouldn't be noisy, but,
Sure.
an active family life. When you're an only child in a rectory,
Yes.
boarding school, to see this, like, nice, low-key family that's not so proper would be fun. So he married my mother.
And they knew each other from sort of what ages?
Probably college. Yeah, probably early college years was when they were.
Okay.
But it was not everyone thought that's a good idea to marry someone who wasn't of the same social class. But
Sure.
my dad did. As my father said, when the Swedish immigrants came over, Mother, it was much harder to get into the country. They had to- if you come over in the 1700s, and anyone could come.
Yeah.
So that was a good way of punching into that story, I thought.
And did you grow up with siblings when you were writing your play about gender reversal when you were 10 years old? Who were the other kids around? And what did they think of all that?
Oh, they wouldn't pay me in mind. They were much older than I were. They were 7 and 6 years older than I am. So
So you're the youngest?
and then there was another one behind me. So we were
Okay.
also we had two in the beginning, and then an only sort of an only child, and then a second only child. Which
And were the ones ahead of you girls or boys?
one girl, one boy, and yeah, it was in the '60s, '70s. So they were very rebellious, long hair,
Hmm.
traveling across the country, hitchhiking, doing crazy things. Not drugs, though. Thank goodness. They
Yeah.
didn't do.
Yeah, my siblings were all older than me. So basically, I grew up with kind of four mothers, three older sisters plus my mom. So, being the very youngest, it was not like a sibling relationship of rivalry or anything like that.
No, it's very different. That's why my little sister is 13 years younger than the big sister, who's the matriarch,
Yeah,
and she sees her as a mother. Like the big sister can boss around the little sister because when there's not,
exactly.
it's very interesting. Now families are two children typically, so we don't have those interesting dynamics. It's rare that there's those interesting dynamics in current families. But hopefully hopefully the twosome can be a nice,
Yeah.
friendly, loving twosome throughout their adult life. That's what I'm going to hope.
Have you gone back and looked at that play anytime in the last few years, or is it so distant you don't even have a copy?
No, I found it one time. I was like, I'd already moved to Canada, I think, and I was in my parents' house, and they make you go through closets when you come home, and I found it in a box. I'd totally forgotten about it, and I was like, I saw it was mimeographed, what we used to call mimeograph, the purple.
Sure. I remember mimeographing.
Yeah, and so they actually at the school they printed it, and I found it. I wonder if I still have it in my attic upstairs. I
So
wonder.
did you take a look?
I did then, and I read it. It was hysterical, and I
How was
remember
it?
doing it. And it was like, at the very end, it was so cliched, and it wasn't like what my family was like. But I wrote these total cliches, and I
Yeah.
remember the girl, and my friend played the little girl was the voice of wisdom, who said, "Come on, mom and dad, let's stop playing poker and stop fighting," and and that was the denouement, and then everything worked perfectly. But yeah,
So
so
at that point, when you were doing a gender role reversal play at age 10, okay, so you're saying that was in the 70s?
yeah, early '70s.
So where do you think you got the kind of not inspiration for the play so much, but what was in the air that you were absorbing that made you think along the lines of sort of Orwellian Animal Farm fiction to make a point, political fiction?
No, it's just that I was, fiction is writing, you know, I was absorbed in the realm of fiction as a child, and absorbed the culture was very much about feminism. I had a
Sure.
subscription to a magazine at that age. Like, we talked about it. It was a big deal. We weren't allowed to wear pants at school when I was a kid. That wasn't fair. We knew
Yeah.
we knew quite, but we didn't know other unfairness. Like I didn't realize at the time that girls didn't really have sports, and I didn't really
Yeah.
know all the things that weren't fair. But my grandmother would tell me some things that were not fair. She was a professor.
What was she teaching?
She would teach humanities, and she was actually, when I was little, she was a Fulbright professor in Damascus and Vietnam and stuff. But she
Wow.
even when we were teenagers, my father found out that she was paid less than the other professors, and he was really mad about it. And she said, "No,
Yeah.
don't say anything, because I'll get in trouble or they'll fire
Yeah.
me." So there was a huge awareness, like in the early '70s, there was a huge outburst of feminism in North America, and so of
Sure.
course you have to absorb that. People were getting divorced, women were going back to work in social work or pottery in my neighborhood, but
Hmm.
so there was that foment all around that we're switching things up. So it's not going to be the same thing. It's not going to be the same thing as all the dads coming home in the station wagons at night
Yeah.
when the mothers stay home all day. That
Yeah.
definitely changed in my generation. Not
Yeah.
so much for the older kids.
When you look back at, you were mentioning you had sort of some suffragette history in your family.
Yeah.
Who was that? Who was that all about? Which side of the family, and what were they doing?
That was my great grandmother. My grandmother's mother was a suffragist, and I have a plaque still in my house that said she was the woman in Georgia who helped get the vote. So
Wow.
she was friends with Frances Willard and Madame Shankai Shek, and in fact, were named for Frances Willard. She was a friend of my grandmother, so they named women in the family Willard. And Willard is known to be a temperance activist, actually,
Yes.
but she was much more than that. She was an economic feminist. She even wrote a book about women on bicycles.
Yeah.
And so yes, that was a part of my history. And the women also in my family went to women's colleges since 1880. That same suffragist, and then my grandmother did. My grandmother always told me to go to women's college,
Which
and
you did.
I did. I did apply to Harvard. I didn't get in, thank goodness, even though my dad and grandmother. But I applied to only women's colleges besides Harvard, and I listened to her, which is interesting. Like, why would this, also my grandmother was a very old school professor, very snobby, racist, Southerner. Why would I have listened to her? To me, it's interesting because most of what my grandmother would say was like, we'd roll our eyes. I mean, not to
Yeah.
we'd let her see that, of course. But so to me now that looking back, I think it's very interesting. I took her advice to go to women's college.
And then you mentioned it earlier, but just tell me again where you
Oh,
went.
I went to Wellesley, which is, she would say,
Yes,
it's the Agnes Scott of the North, because
sure.
there
And then
there are.
Wellesley started admitting men at some point, I think.
No, it did not.
It never
No,
did.
no, no. You can
What
come
was
for a term. Vassar.
Vassar did? That's it. Yeah.
Vassar.
And then when you were at Wellesley, were you kind of seeing people from Harvard and doing that whole thing, or were you?
A little bit of dating. I'm like, it wasn't a huge part of my life, but there was a truck that went back and forth. But it's, you get very absorbed in the school, and it's a great community when you're living in a big group of
Sure.
women. Like,
What were the house rules like while you were there in the years when you were at Wellesley,
oh, you
in
mean like
terms of,
dating stuff?
like, curfews come in by a certain hour,
Oh, no, no,
men in
no,
your
no,
room?
no, no. Anything you wanted to.
Okay, because by that point that had sort of gone away, I guess.
That's right. That's right. It was totally. But there was a reception desk that would have to buzz people in. You
Yeah,
weren't allowed to come in. So, and then there was a codification of, you'd say, and everyone had to. It was a communal thing. You had to do the desk every so often. You had a shift,
yeah.
and they would say a caller was a man. There's a caller here to see
As a
you. Or
caller, right?
there was coded language to know whether you had to, you know, take your shower cap off to go to the front desk and see who
Hmm.
was there. But it was a great environment. I can't say there's something about when you're in an all women's environment, living in a otherwise not culture that is not friendly to women.
Mm.
You just see women blossom and they take leadership. And I would say that when you first got there, people would be saying, "I think Ionesco is," and they're very unsure. But by the end, they're like, "Ionesco is clearly commenting on the absurdity of life."
Yeah, yeah,
They would find their voice, and it's very true. And a friend of mine who used to work in film would say that they when people would come to the office for an interview, they do a guessing game about whether the woman had gone to a women's college or not, just by the
yeah,
way she held
yeah.
herself. It could be different now, maybe there's other ways that women can get that confidence. The Girl Scouts has a similar function. It teaches people that they're the center of the story, that they're the
Mm.
subject of a sentence, and they're not just a direct object waiting to be part of waiting for a verb to happen to them.
In the years you were there, were you in a dorm housing at the school the whole time? Is that how they ran it, or your senior year did you do
Mostly, I
something
think
else?
I went off campus one term just for fun because it seemed fun to have an apartment. Then I went to Paris for 1 year just because that's such a bourgeois thing to do, and it's actually cheaper.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, it's the campus life is very. And then I did plays there too. I just kept on doing feminist plays at Wellesley. Yeah,
Were
more.
you writing any of those, or
Yes,
simply
yes,
put?
I would act one. I did a Picasso. I used to act in plays, and I wrote one feminist play that I put on in French. I mean, it's just crazy times, but it was. You can explore whatever you want to, but
Were your professors women or men, or all of the above?
they were both. But it was definitely a place where you didn't. It wasn't. The leadership was female,
Hmm.
and which is unusual compared to most universities. Like that's something that we think about a lot at Gender Affairs. That not only do we look at private companies, but anytime a woman gives up money, wouldn't she like to know that her money's going to an institution that gives her fairness? Like universities are
Sure.
terribly unfair, right? Women are paying
Yes.
$70,000 a year, and the leadership at universities and deans and the higher paid professors are mostly men, 74%, according to this one study. So
Yeah.
to me, that's incredibly unfair to prepare these women for the world and not give them every sort of advantage of a totally fair environment. I would want my money. I would want some money back actually
Yeah.
if I were
When
going to.
you were writing these plays in school, and then in France, were you studying in French or in English?
Yes, French. Yes, the hard
And
stuff.
where was that? Were you at the Sorbonne, or where were you?
Yeah, they call it the Sensei New Sorbonne, but the American schools will always do some sort of program. So I think mine was with UCal Berkeley, and it was a center of semiotics and film, and it was.
And then what were you studying in France that was maybe different than what you were doing in the States?
Well, I was studying semiotics and structuralism, and which they don't really, was sort of beginning back there in North America. It certainly wasn't. It was
Hmm.
certainly a great lens to put on cultural studies, and it was hard and Freud, I liked it, and it was good for the French. And yeah,
And where were you living in Paris?
I lived in the seventh, right off Invalides. I lived
And
in
what sort of a housing was it? An apartment you shared with someone or by yourself or
it
school?
was a a lovely flat that a French professor, very bourgeois kind of, she was professor, had fur coats and stuff. She rented it out because she needed some money, and I got to live with this really fun, elegant French professor of sociology of architecture, and I got to meet her friends, and
Mm.
it was super fun. I'm so glad I didn't live in a dorm. I got to
Yeah,
live
it's
with a
great.
real French woman and see her boyfriends all the time come in and out of the house, and her cry, "Oh, little Mac," and learn how they live. It was great. I think all Americans actually, to the point that your newest book, you talk about how American relationship. I mean, in America, we don't really value relationships as
Yeah.
much as family, and I think you learn in the European culture is so much more about that. And
Hmm.
for, middle class Americans who are taught that ambition and the church of greed is where you have to worship, I think it's a great point of view to see that other people just live. They live and they work to live. They don't live to work, and
Yes,
the hard thing,
exactly.
it really, blows you away at first as an American to see like these kids. Why do they care so much about food? It's all day who's
Yeah.
making food. Whereas like you could get so much work done in that day. You're like, you know what? It's Sunday. Why are you? So for me, it was a great vision of just that work isn't the only thing.
How did that kind of change your view of anything in particular or nothing at all? When you came back, were you kind of feeling different than when you left, as in just a very different perspective? Or did it modify your style of feminism in some way, or did it change it, or what? How did that influence you?
I don't think so. It just sort of taught me that food is really fun, and you have to try to keep these sensory pleasures. Like the other thing, the middle class Protestant American life. I mean, I don't know. You grew up in Switzerland, a pretty Protestant, but it's like food is not a pleasure. You just
Right.
work. It was very. It's when you North American culture is so puritanical. It's very nice to
Hmm.
get away from that a bit. So I think that actually it leavened that aspect of my life. I didn't get rid of my middle class ambition. Sadly,
Yeah.
it's hard to get rid of that. It's hard to get rid of that. You have to support yourself and find jobs. But I would say that's what it did for me. It sort of taught me that there's this life, it's a way of living your life every day with as much
Mm.
beauty as you can.
Yeah.
And so that's what I would say I learned from that. I'm not sure I learned enough about the relationships and family because
Mm.
again, in America we move around, right? We don't live near our
Yes.
family as they do. We don't have these long-term relationships. The Canadians do a bit more, but
Well, and the idea of a family home, staying put, somebody's always in the same place where they grew up, and that's taken much more for granted in Europe. Here, everybody, as I write about, they move an average of 7 times, and it's always for a job opportunity. The idea that you stay in one place is a little more foreign to a lot of Americans. Let me ask you a question. When you were transitioning from the school period of your life, I know you've done some writing. Can we just talk for a little while about the kind of things you've written? We know something about the plays now, but not much else.
plays. They were nothing but no. I was a professional writer. I wrote for food. I wrote for money. So my first job out of school was working at a law, working on a legal book, a legal textbook. I did indexing. My second
Yes,
first magazine. Then I worked in Hollywood for a bit. My first writing job was at Shape magazine, actually, the exercise magazine. It's the first job
sure.
I got. And but I developed one of the first women's midlife magazine for them because they told me to look for. They wanted to
Were
do
you
a.
going to an office every day or working from
Oh yeah,
home?
totally working. Yeah, so I was an editor. I was a junior editor. So I was a.
Where was the office?
It was in California in
Hmm.
Woodland Hills. So and I think it's been bought by Meredith now. But it was a funny upstart little California magazine about fitness. My parents were terribly embarrassed, but I
Yeah.
wrote fitness stories. But then I also started a new magazine with them, which was great because when you're in California, it's much more open culture. I am 24. They asked me to research something for seniors, and I said, seniors don't want to hear about fitness.
Yeah.
I read all the what are they called? The media kits about selling advertising the
Hmm.
magazines would send out, and they were always would stop. Women would stop. The readership would stop at age 40. I was like, wait a second. Women don't die at age 40.
Yeah.
Why are they going to sell to women 40 to 65? Like,
Yeah.
there's a lot of women there. So and there I was at 24, and I got to like start the germ of this idea of this midlife women's magazine. Finally, it came out. I left eventually, but it did finally come out. So that was kind of cool to have sort of someone say, "Yes, let's do this." And but I did notice there was a sort of a gap in discussion of midlife. So I became sort of like my friends would see my apartment in LA, and I had all these books about menopause and aging, and they'd say, "What are you, like, honorarily menopausal? You're 24 years old. You're 25."
Yeah.
So that was a great opportunity. I really enjoyed that. And then later on, I moved to Canada, and I worked for magazines in Washington for a bit, and then I worked in Canada in magazines, and I worked as a senior editor at the major women's magazine here called Chatelaine, which
And
people might.
what brought you to Canada, and when was that?
I married a Canadian, and I married one of the few Canadians who hates America, would never live in America.
Okay.
So
And did that move become the move that put you there today where you're sitting?
yes,
Or was
yes,
that an
yes.
earlier thing and then you went
Same
back?
man, same house. Yes,
You've been in Canada since then?
since then.
And
Yes,
he's Canadian,
he's Canadian. Our main house is the house he grew up in the country.
which
Yep,
is where?
it's outside of Toronto. It's
Okay.
yes, and so he's one of the
South,
few people.
north, on the lake, where is it?
West, west,
West.
west. Built by a man who walked up from New Jersey in 1789.
Okay. So when you say he doesn't like the States, is it a kind of a political thing or aesthetic or cultural, or how's that work?
There are some Canadian nationalists. Not
No,
everyone
no,
loves.
I know that. I know that.
And so he's a Canadian nationalist, and yeah, I know some other ones, very educated, privileged people, and they wouldn't leave Canada, like people in the film
Well,
business.
good point. I mean, I like Canada. I wouldn't leave either if I had roots there. Why would you?
Why would you? I mean, because people, ambitious people want to go down to the States, and they do. And sometimes they come back, and sometimes they don't. But
Yeah.
it's a very livable country, and especially from a feminist point of view. Look, when I had my children, I worked for the major publisher, one of the biggest publishers in the country, and I had two children. And I used to get a check in the mail, which was, I can't tell you how good that felt, Frank.
Yeah,
Like
sure.
the government wrote me a check, and I would like walk down the stairs when the mail came, and I heard the mail slot come, and I'd get the check, and I felt great. I was exhausted. I was taking care of my babies. Like, it was really
Yeah.
hard. My mother's nowhere to be found. I don't have any other helpers. My husband was away a lot. But that check made me feel like the government said, this is important.
Yes. Yeah, we
And
need you and we've got your back. My daughter, Jessica, who now lives and works in the New York area, but who was 10 years old when we moved here from Switzerland. She'd been in the public schools over there and actually spent a pretty short amount of time here, went to high school, then went to NYU for a couple of years, then dropped out, married a Finnish American musician and composer, moved there. Point being, had her two kids there, finished university, got a check in the mail, home visits for her babies from the health system, everything free. Her kids went through universities in Europe, could choose any EU school they wanted to go to. One went to the University of Helsinki, the other went to a school in Holland. And there was always a sense that, the government is on the side of families and they put their money where their mouth is, literally. It's a completely different thing than in the United States. And now she moved back here for work and has done very well, quote unquote. I mean, in terms of the way you measure success in this world of job title and so on. But she's very glad she did what she did. And it gave her the ability to have children in an order that made some kind of biological sense, with fertility clocks at a time when it was easy to have babies, but not just easy biologically, but made easy for you by the Finnish government.
right. It's so I don't really understand, and that's such a contradiction in American culture, isn't it? That they say, "Oh, we love children and motherhood and apple pie." I was like, no, they don't love
No, they
mothers and
don't.
children. And also the fact that they let this, the word for, they talk about human capital in the business world, like
Mhm.
personnel, human capital, and it's like, well, why would you not invest more in this capital or take better care of it? Like,
Yeah.
certain countries will, in Scotland, I know a friend of mine's father was working in the mines, and they used to give every Scottish kid an exam
Hmm.
at age 11 or something like that. And this kid, even though he's working in the mines, not even going to school, he got the highest score in Scotland or something, or one of the highest scores. So they took him out of the mines immediately and brought him to school. Now, why wouldn't you do that? Why wouldn't
Yeah.
a company look for, I mean, of course, everyone deserves not to work in the mines, but it's very hard for me to understand why, not all children in America get the same nurturing so that they could turn out to,
Mm.
you know, do math or, or be the best caregivers or anything they could be. Like they don't really, they're not nurturing that human possibility. It's quite sad.
Yeah, and the thing is, of course, from my background, I know you know a little bit about me and this book I've written about. Of course, I write for a living, so I've got a lot of books out there. But the one I've got right now is on how little emphasis we really put on what are genuine family values, which has nothing to do with the way that term is usually used by the right. And what's crazy is that the people who use that term most, bandy it around most, family values, family values, family values, have been people on the conservative, often religious right. And yet, when it comes to any measurable advancement of family values, they're always on the wrong side. So paid paternity and maternity leave. Nope, we don't want to do that. That's socialism. Healthcare for all. Nope, that's socialism too. Childcare provisions for women. No. Corporate childcare. Why should a corporation have to provide childcare? Touch them where you will. It's all fake family values. And so, as I look back on my involvement with that world in the 1970s and 80s, it's very clear to me that what we were doing was basically just repackaging misogyny and pitching it as a family value. I mean, in a really Orwellian kind of doublethink. It was just the opposite.
And not just
of course, and that doesn't even get into, pardon me?
Sorry, not just misogyny, inequality too, because that means
absolutely. It all went with it.
You get a bootstrap. Here, baby.
But of course, on the conservative side, it comes from an original kind of theological position of biblical theology, which says, look, God has instituted a certain order in creation, male and female. Here's how it rolls. Men are meant to lead, women are meant to follow. And as I put it in my book, of course, what that groomed me to be as a young teen father who had gotten Jeannie pregnant when we were 17 and 18. And we've been together 52 years now, and we're very different people than we were then. But in those days, just to be blunt about it, I describe myself as an asshole by divine right, because I was brought up essentially being told that, what we now call toxic masculinity was God's will for you. Shove people around, bully them, dominate the men in your life so you can succeed and pull ahead. That's the way God made us. And when it comes to the women in your life, you're supposed to be in charge. So all that kind of bullying, instinctual behavior gets blessed. So instead of the spiritual environment you're in being a check on that, saying, hey, wait a minute, there's a more moral and empathetic way to see this, it's the opposite. It pats you on the head and says, no, go for it. You got to be in charge here. So, that's my background. So I get this whole discussion from the inside out as someone who's radically changed their views and is very ashamed looking back in terms of, what we were doing and has tried hard to push in the other direction. But I'm interested in the process for you. And this is none of my business, but since I'm pretty self-revealing in my work, I always ask personal questions. When you got married to your Canadian husband, how old were you guys?
27, 28,
okay.
28.
And then how soon did you have your kids?
Well, now you're talking about the infertility bitch, and she is not nice to everyone. So
no, I understand that.
Took a while, 5 years. More than that. I wrote a book and then I tried, but anyway. But I have a question about.
And what was the book? Let me just interrupt you there. What was the book?
It was a book. It was a social history of summer houses. It was sort of like, if you remember the work of Witold Rybczynski. I used to write at the time I was writing the Canadian newspaper. I wrote essays. So I was inspired by Witold Rybczynski, and I wrote a sort of a social history of the summer house, like this idea in North American life. We took this European aristocratic house and we changed it and we gave it different values. That was the thesis of the book. So like we gave it values of religion, right? It was very connected to Chautauquas and those what do they used to call them? The groves. Back in the 18th century, my family in Georgia with the first grove. Like it was nature always had God. Going to nature had God to it in North America, whereas in Europe it had a different feeling. Anyway, so that was about. It was about the social history of summer. It was sort of
that's great.
Trying to make it sound smarter than it is, and look at sort of the deeper meaning at it. And I told stories, and it was a good thing. And then I wrote another book after that, and then I just went to back to work. But back
to work as a writer within the magazine industry, editing.
Being an editor, yes, yeah.
By the way, as of right now, are you still doing any of that kind of work, or are
no, I gave that work up entirely because I find that work is very ego based, and I wanted to get rid of my ego You know, it's like when you're a writer, it's all about you. You're trying to get people to pay attention to you, you know, read your
Don't worry
book,
about the dog, by the way.
right? Read your books. He's a great lad.
Yeah.
Um, anyway, what was I saying? Yes, I didn't want to do that, and I had little children, and I lived in the country. And why to be a writer, you're
Yeah.
all by yourself, and you're involved in your own ego. And I didn't want to do that with my children younger. I didn't like. It's an unhealthy life because then you'd be desperate for adult company at the end of the day.
Sure. No, I understand.
So
When you were raising the kids and they were young, where was your husband and what was he doing?
Um, I still want to go back to that family values thing. He was working, he had a family company that he was running, and it was very hard. He had to travel around the world, and it was very intense. It was very intense. He had 200 employees. It was, you know, life
Sure.
and death situations. It was very hard. So, it was, we did, the whole family did everything to support this company. It was very important, but, you know, yeah, so I didn't want to, and I wanted to go back to work, I wanted to do something that was actually more meaningful. I wanted to do, not
Yeah.
meaningful, I wanted to do something with a group of people. I wanted to work on, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I wanted to see if I could
Mm.
use my talents to solve a problem. Like, I'm not sure I chose the right problem to fix, Frank. I maybe
Yeah.
should have done something else. Maybe I should have asked some children in my town if they need me to read to them. But I decided to use my talents as a feminist and a journalist and as a woman of, and my privilege as a woman of capital to build this index. And
The
you know,
index being,
the gender fair index, like to
yes,
measure
right.
companies. Because, you know, we've, as I said, I've been talking about inequality since I was a kid. I marched for the ERA in high school, and we've had so little progress. It's quite
Mm.
upsetting. One time I was reviewing a book. I used to review books for the, you know, the national newspaper here, and I was reviewing a book for Naomi Wolf, if you don't remember her. She wrote a book called
Sure. No, I know Naomi Wolf well. Sure.
The Beauty Myth. Yeah. So I was reviewing her second book, Fire with Fire. And this was a turning point in my life as a feminist, as a person, and as a writer. And one of the chapters, she did a byline count of the writers at the major magazines, Harper's, Atlantic, New Yorker. And when I
Mm.
was a kid, my parents got Harper's, Atlantic, and New Yorker, and that was always my dream. I used to study the New Yorker.
Yes.
I was going to write for the New Yorker, Harper's, and Atlantic. Anyway, in reviewing this book, I saw that there were very few women who wrote for Harper's, Atlantic, and the New Yorker, and if they did, they wrote for poetry, cooking, or books.
Mm.
And it blew me away. I was maybe 29 or 30 years old. I thought, oh my gosh, I don't have an equal shot at that, sort of mathematically speaking.
Yeah.
It's just and I'm sad to say some women might have said, oh well, that's nope, I'm going to do it anyway. And I looked at that and I went, oh my God, that's very unlikely that I can have that dream that I wanted.
Hmm.
So
I have a question for someone who's tracked with so much of the feminist movement, starting when you're 10 and writing that play, which I find charming and wonderful, given that I'm taking care of grandchildren right now, that same age, 13, 11, and 7. I took Nora, the little girl, skiing yesterday. She's great. We have such a good friendship, and I'll be picking her up at school after we do this because Jeannie and I have done the childcare. Jeannie, my wife, and I have done the childcare. So my daughter-in-law and my son can pursue their career and so forth. It's been very good being a grandparent, by the way. I have the 2 older grandchildren, but they grew up in Europe and we're all friends and they visit. But it's very different when 3 little kids live across the street. So that's what I've been doing for the
lovely.
last 13 years.
Lovely. So
Yeah, it's really
nice.
great. So anyway, but my experience as a parent and a spouse and someone who partnered so young and so forth gradually has changed the way I see things that I was very passionate about at other points of my life. And I'm not talking about the big changes of going from, a fundamentalist evangelical background to I guess you'd call me a progressive or liberal activist and things like on issues, many issues. But I find that when you talk to people who have been very energized by either a political movement, a party, like I have friends who are very invested in being Democratic operatives within the party. They raise a lot of money. They do stuff. Feminist friends like you who are tremendously energized by their thing. But the discussion's always on 2 levels. There's the public persona,
Mm-hmm.
and then there is a discussion you have with them after a couple of drinks when you're at their house, where they are not having doubts about what they believe, but they are somewhat embarrassed by what you might call false steps and excesses of the movement they're in or directions it's currently taking and so forth. And I'm wondering with you, as you look at how your own thinking is has grown over the years, what you've changed your mind on that you were very certain about in another stage of your feminist activity, if anything, and how you see the movement, aside from the fact that it's horribly frustrating that the world at large has not come far enough, fast enough, in pay equity and all sorts of other areas. The harassment of women in the workplace is a standard kind of, oh, well, that's just how things are. So many things. But without sort of maintaining the public persona, how do you think the movement has evolved? For instance, I look back at certain things that Germaine Greer wrote, and I just think they're off the wall and we're wrong, and set a foot in the wrong direction of trying to set up a sort of as if somehow partnerships between men and women are always about a competition between male and female, when actually sometimes you can come to a different kind of partnership within a marriage or whatever it may be. That's not a very good example, but I'm just wondering, on your own thinking, how you see the movement as a movement, irrespective of how much progress it's made or not made. Have you thought about feminism itself, its place? Short answer from me, I see feminism not as a social movement or a political movement, but as an actual evolutionary step. And I mean that in the biological sense.
Yeah, no, I saw that in your book. That's interesting.
Yeah, so that's, my view has changed. I don't see it politically as much. I see it as like, no, this is the future. And gender equity isn't a nice little trimming on the political cake. It's the difference between survival on a planetary level and not, because women make better leaders. And we need to recognize that. So I see it very differently than I once did.
Well, I would say I wouldn't say better leaders. I'd say when you have like biodiversity, when you have a diversity of leadership.
Yeah, I think so too. But I really honestly believe that women make good leaders for incredible reasons, because they are, the way I see it is women are the only people who pay biological forfeit for their gender. My life has never been, my son volunteered from the Marine Corps, okay? But other than that, no male in my family's life has been in danger because we are male, where I've watched my wife deliver 3 children. One, she almost died during, I've watched her bleed out almost after she had one period turned into a nightmare, and we thought it was a miscarriage. Men don't have any stuff like this. So in a funny way, because women are so united with natural rhythms that have been foisted on them as kind of the hand they play, we take this for granted. But I must say, as time's gone on, I don't. And I think that somehow that gives women this idea of cooperative association, a completely different thing than men can ever achieve. This idea that it's not the survival of the fittest, it's the survival of the friendliest. And the idea of cooperation and community, I don't think it's a woman's thing, but I think women feel it and see it and lead that way much more clearly than men do, and therefore are actually better leaders. But that's my view. I'm not trying to impose that on you.
I don't believe in that sort of essentialist that women are better at anything. I think all humans have,
Well, good, because I'm
both sides. But the fact that we can start valuing what's female in the culture, and as you said, and in your book you talk about how men can receive it as a gift too, which
that's what I'm saying.
I do a thing. I do a little. I have a little habit when in the old days when you'd be in the cities and you could open a door, I'd always hold the doors open for men.
Yeah.
And they say, no. I said, this is gender equality. We help you. I always do.
Sure.
For me, it was a funny joke, but I'd love to do it. Sometimes they'd go like, what? And then they laugh. And I was just trying to say, like, it's not all of us. It's like, it's not all a power grab. It's like power, and it's a sharing grab.
Yeah.
And so, but hopefully that's what it would, if the more women lead, the more we can have diverse perspectives and different ways of solving problems instead of the same old. I hope we do have, we don't have many women leaders. Look, we don't have enough women leaders in Congress to pass legislation to value mothers, to value
Yeah,
parents.
I mean, just have parental leave, nothing.
Not even. So, like, it goes back to, like, if you don't share power in a culture, we can't change a culture.
Speaking of which, before we have that number of women in Congress, how do you see, what we call male allyship? How do you
That's key.
reach out?
That's key. So that's the main thing. It's like in all this world that I've been in for many years now, I wouldn't call myself an activist, but these rooms of women, there are too many rooms of women talking to women, and this happens all the time. And they have conferences, and sometimes they're created by a male-owned company that makes money off of women talking about the problems that women have. It's just so absurd. It's absurd. And the change, when we do see change, like in the corporate field, which is something that I've been studying for a few years, like it's when a male CEO who has the power takes real action. Because if it comes from the below, I don't know much about corporate culture, but it's harder to boil up, bubble up. But when a man CEO says, we're going to change this, and they put some money to it, and they tell everyone that's what they want to do, they can create cultural and
Right.
corporate change. So I think, of course, male allyship is the key thing, and of course, women have to take power, but people have to pass it along too. So I think the more, we have people like you who are understanding that this sharing of resources between men and women is a positive thing. That's what we hope for. There's all these.
Well, and as you were mentioning, I have a whole chapter in my book about why it'd be one way to look at the feminist movement so far and feel that the men who have benefited from it actually have come out, benefiting more in some ways than women, because the changes have not really been made that are large enough to benefit enough women, although it's going in the right direction, however glacially or geologically, as you put it. But on the other hand, all these studies that show that, men who die on the actuarial tables 5 to 7 years younger than women on average in countries like Iceland and Switzerland, where there's much more gender parity and it's been accepted, both socially and politically, and actually works out. If you look at the number of seats in parliament and so forth, it really is 50-50, or even in Finland now more women than men.
I like that.
Men,
You talked about life expectancy.
men live as long as women. I mean, what's not to love? I mean, and I found
a great argument, Frank. That's a great argument.
It's a true one. I mean, I'm not making that up.
It was like I read that. I was like, wow,
and the numbers are all there to support it. But I find it in my own life, having really come to a place of genuine partnership and equity in our own home. I'm not saying everything's perfect. We still have arguments, but it's not about that. It's not about that kind of thing. The relief of not having to be the sole provider all the time, and B, the bully in residence trying to run everything. It's fantastic. Plus, you each find your talents. I'm shit for brains when it comes to investment. I wasted, several small, not fortunes, but several small things that could have been great nest eggs. When Jeannie took over, everything was great. I do all the dishes and I cook and I take care of grandchildren. I love it, and I write for a living. But, Jeannie has a very sharp, steel trap for a brain when it comes to money. She runs everything. I don't even know where the checkbook is. So that's a kind of a gender equity where, you actually figure out what your talents are. And there's not a male role and a female role. It's like, hey, we're a family. How do we make this work? Here are the things we're good at. But if you go in with the set idea that, I've got to be in charge, you're screwed, because now you're doing stuff you don't even do well.
Right. So, but do you think a lot of men have had that ability to loosen their gender roles, or are their laces still pretty tight?
I think men's laces are still pretty tight, and I don't blame individuals, but culturally,
No, of course not.
and I think it comes back to a lot of what I talk about in my book, and that is, look, all the scientific evidence now points in the direction very, very clearly, just like this longevity business, that men actually evolved as nurturers, that it really does take a village, that you and me would not be sitting here talking if women had been the only people to care for children, if women had never had help raising families. It always has been village. And the scientists that go back to the hunter-gatherer period and look at this really carefully, point out that without sharing within community, both male, female, but also there'd be no survival. It is the cooperative people that survived, and the real hard-ass, meanest ones don't. It's the opposite of survival of the fittest. So what I'm trying to say is I think that our culture has done a lot to deprive men. And if you look at myself, there were periods of my life when I was all about striving, but given half a chance to appreciate, sharing childcare, for instance. Look at the polls the New York Times printed. 45% of the men polled after staying home with their young kids for a year said that they'd rather be doing that than return to their careers as it was. They were given a timeout to think about it.
I missed that poll. That's great.
Yeah, really. I mean, but the thing is, they didn't. It took a pandemic to give them a timeout to think about, hey, what the hell, man? I'm spending my whole life doing this thing, and I happen to enjoy being here with my 3-year-old. They had to be there, do that. I mean, so far men have been deprived, not in the same way women have, but the whole culture has started with this assumption about men sort of grasping careerism and so on. And you know, it's ridiculous because given half a chance, I mean, my son's one of them, and it's not because of any influence of mine. He's a Marine. He was in Afghanistan. He lives across the street. He had to be at home for a year. Now he's renegotiated his deal with the company where he's a product manager, saying, "You want me to keep working for you? Okay, I'm coming in 1 day a week because I get to drive my kids to school in the morning. I pick them up, and I'm home for meals with them. Forget it. I'm not coming back in." And he's not the only one. The whole story of the Great Resignation. So I'm just saying, from your point of view and gender fair, we've got to keep finding out how to reach out to these male allies, because I think they're there if given half a chance. Not all of them, not the old crazy guys running the whole thing sometimes, you know, and in these stupid financial companies. But there's a lot of younger men who just seem ready to look at it again. And I don't know, have you run into any of that? I mean, do you find the younger generation is more open to this?
And that's what all the research says. But I think it's interesting what you said about the pandemic parenting is that, you know, of course, paternity leave has been on the books for a few years in a lot of places.
Right.
Not many people take it because there's sort of a social shaming around or stigma, or it's, you know, it's not considered macho not to work. So the fact that men actually were able to all do the same thing together instead of just the ones who were talked into it, I think that's very powerful, and that will make a greater change. So not the ones that just were sort of brave enough to try to take pat leave, but I think that will really change things. Although that will definitely change things because, yeah, it's a whole group. When a whole group does something differently, that changes the group, doesn't it?
I have a wonderful friend, Amanda, in New York, and Ernie will type me a note in my thing. I've forgotten her last name, but I interviewed her on this program, and she's a pastor of a church in Manhattan. And in a panel discussion we did, she said, if you are a man who wants to help women's rights in this area, the single most powerful thing you can do is not advocate for women's maternity leave, but take paternity leave when it's offered you. So the women who are working with don't stand out as the only people in your company who do this. Right. And stop listening to this bullshit that says if you take paternity leave, you're not as serious about career and you'll never make the partnership or whatever it is. So she made an interesting point when we were talking, just looking at men straight up and saying, take these things that are given you and embrace them, so women don't feel singled out as the only people who do this, that it's a really positive thing.
The American
Amanda, Ernie's just put it up. Amanda Hambrick Ashcroft. She's a great woman, and she has these kids, and she does this whole thing about being stuck in a 2-room apartment in Manhattan with two young children all through the COVID pandemic. And just, you know, she's really fiery on this whole issue. So I had a good time talking to her.
I think you're right. To take parental leave, and also the thing I've always hated about the American work culture is that it always says that labor has to be sold in these 40-hour units.
Right.
You get a special bonus of an extra 20 hours that you don't pay for. So it's very rigid, and that doesn't allow for any of these nice moments or, you know, pandemic parenting. So, you know, every other thing I would sell you, at a potato, I can sell you 1 potato, I can sell you a bushel of potatoes, I can sell you frozen French fries. Why is labor this unmovable unit? It's actually very anti-capitalist that, like, the market has only one kind of labor to buy, and it's very hard.
It seems to me that, you know, one of the problems we have, and at this again, it has to be done, we have to convince executives in companies, male or female, but it's going to be mostly male because of the problems you're talking about, that, you know, so far gender equity has been along the lines of, look, this is how men do it, and you come in as a woman, you're going to have to do it this way too. Whereas I take a very different point of view in my book, which, by the way, I'm going to have to mention the title at some point, is Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy.
All the things. I love it.
And my point of view is, hey, there's got to be another step here where we say, no, please, you know, let's not imitate all the stupidity that the business community has brought in the name of this is just how we do it from a male point of view. With the women, please rescue the men from a type of careerism that is destroying their lives too. You know, again, the pandemic points this out. Men are very unhappy with this arrangement. They would like to be at home more too. They would like to have a little more vacation time too. If it didn't cost them their job or advancement by not being taken as seriously, you know, they would like to interrupt their residency at Mass General and have a kid when they're in their 30s at a time when there's some fertility hope for their wife not to have to do IVF. I mean, it's ridiculous. And I think that, it's time now to not only demand gender equity, but not on the terms offered by shareholder profits at any cost. It has to be on a more human field. So it's equality, but I don't want to see people just demanding equality in a system that is so flawed that to become equal in that system, it's like you have not won a good prize here because the thing is not good. And you can see that in the unhappiness of men, the loneliness statistics, the suicide statistics. It's not working for them either. What you were talking about, this 40-hour package set in cement, this is not working for anybody.
Right. And then what you talked about is not be the burden of being the sole breadwinner. I mean, I know women who have it, and men who have it, but it's not ideal to be the sole breadwinner is a very, very difficult place. So the more that couples can share that is a much healthier household. And
I guess the big question is how big of a revolution are we pushing for? Because it is going to have to be a revolution. Are we just looking for some gender parity to play in this field when we don't like the game anyway? Like we're all going to have to play lacrosse, even if we think it's a shit sport and don't enjoy it, because that's the game we're playing? Or can we say, hey, listen, I'd like to play the game I want to play? My daughter really makes this point, and I quote Jessica in my book. She's the CEO of an investment company that does green energy stuff. And people ask her, like, how are you qualified to do that? How did you get to be a CEO? So, they say so young because she's pushing 50 now, but it was young for taking over a financial company. And she was saying, well, it has nothing to do with what I learned in the world of business. It's because I had my kids and, was living in Finland where I got some support. And what I learned from managing that and working as a working mother is why I can be an executive. And people don't want to hear that because to them, these are separate worlds.
Really?
And she talks all about how, all her meetings on Zoom, suddenly there's toddlers running through the woman room and, hey, she's working with men that she didn't even know they had a family because this would never even come up. In other words, this idea you talked about in France, where you're on vacation and food's important and family and the family home, it's so far into the American way of thinking. For us, it's all business all the time or you're not serious.
Right. But you're dead. You're serious your whole life, and then you're dead. So does your daughter then run a different kind of corporate culture?
Yes, she does. And, all the stuff that we're talking about, she does to the best of her ability within the limits of what they're able to do. But, one of her best employees in Italy, when she was running the company out of Modena before she relocated to New York and became CEO of the company, when she was running their Modena office in Italy, which for very selfish reasons, I wish she was still over there. Because we enjoyed visiting her in Italy. Sure. I remember calling her, and there was a young woman working in our office who had happened to run across my stuff online and said to Jessica, is your father Frank Schaeffer? And yes, and so forth. So we got talking with Benedetta, and Jessica could not afford to, quote, lose her as an employee because she was one of her best people. But Benedetta had this long relationship with this French guy that wanted to marry her, but they would have, and Jessica said, get out of here, start your life. We'll get together some other time. You always wanted to study art, go back to Paris and study art, be with him. If you're in love, marry him, start a life. Well, I get notes from Benedetta sort of tangentially, now we all kind of know each other, staying in the loop as it was to Jessica, the whole thing was a family, including the people working for her, even when it wasn't to her corporate advantage. Instead of saying, hey, if you're serious about your career, you'll stick here, you're running the off, So yeah, she does it differently. And she says the younger women who work with her, their minds are just blown. Like they don't run into this. How is this possible? Here's a woman.
Does she have different policies, or is it just sort of an ethic in the business?
I should interview her on this and find out. But yeah, she does have different policies. It's how she runs her business. But I think when it comes to maternity, paternity leave, family stuff, yes, she does. And everybody, can work from home. She closed their office. She had a place down in Manhattan, and she said, this is ridiculous. Nobody needs to come in. You're all doing a great job. We'll meet once a week and we'll get a room somewhere and meet. Go stay home. So she's always been on anything that favors that kind of working with people, she's right on it.
Hmm. Well, that's very important because a lot of men and women both want those kinds of.
Well, she says the men are thrilled.
Right.
You know, she has men who haven't dared to tell her that they're even engaged because, like, is this going to, you know, I mean, I'm not being facetious. There's an attitude that you just pretend it's all business and you'll get further down the road. And of course, in the New York area, it's very aggressive in that market.
Right. It's terrible. Terrible. It can't be human. Can't do
It's
it. Be
ridiculous.
human.
So talk a little bit. We haven't gone there because I talked to Jose a little bit about Gender Fair, but let's use the last couple of minutes here. Let's talk about Gender Fair and tell people how they can get the app and all that good
Or
stuff.
just about, you talked about a revolution. I think that's the thing. I think that, you know, if you're talking about making a huge change of people loving and having children and saving the planet, I think what's key to remember is that a lot of people give up their power. We don't realize, like, the people who want these changes that you're talking about, that's a large percentage of the population. And it's astonishing how we can't get our votes listened to in a way, you know, like, so I think I would encourage everyone to realize that if how larger groups of people can get things done, and I hope that we do, especially when it comes to women. Like, you know, women, we have a lot of money in the investment world, we have a lot of money in the consumer world, we have a lot of tuition we pay taxes, and women aren't getting very much back for all we pay. The same amount of money into these systems, cultures, and we're treated as though it was 200 years ago when we had no rights. And I have a hard time understanding that, but that's true for everyone, you know. Like, there's a woman who runs something that's similar to what we do called the Black Dollar Index, which I love. She looks at big companies from which people buy all the time and gives them a rating on how they serve Black people. Well, that's great, because you stop, you know, you don't have to buy from companies like that. And I love this attitude of, you know, if you don't patronize businesses that support politicians you don't like. These are all things that are within our control.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we're going to put the links to Gender Fair up. Ernie will put all this up wherever we put up this podcast. When it comes out as a podcast, all the links will be there. Anything else you want to direct people toward that Ernie can do? I mean, that you would like us, when we put this up in various venues, to post the link to Gender Fair? Anything else you want people
to
look
about Gender
at?
Fair? We do great work around companies. We've been rating colleges. We're talking about rating agriculture. We want to put a sort of a gender and a fairness lens on a lot of different institutions, because that helps them change. Because we think that people don't question the way things are, and they just think, oh, well, it's fine, we have a woman on the board and we offer paternity leave. But there's way more you can do to create
Absolutely
fairness for more people. So that's what we do, is we help all different kinds of organizations see to put a lens of fairness on their systems.
Well, we will link people to you. And
it was a delight mainly to talk to you, Frank. That'll be the highlight of my week. The party of my week was talking to you.
Well, we'll have to do it again. I mean, hey, if that's all it takes to give you the highlight, I'm here. You know, I'm sitting in the snow.
I can't think of anything I like better than a conversation with a new person.
We'll have another one.
I'm a vampire. I need people's new blood.
Well, we'll check in again. So, okay. You know, much love and all the best to you and your family. And thank you so much for taking the time, Amy. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
But I've heard so much about you. It was lovely to talk to you.
Thank you.